Welcome to Beyond the Known, everyone. Whenever someone requests a deep dive on psychic abilities, it's always a bit like opening a mystery box. And you've definitely given us an interesting one this time. We got like articles and research snippets, even a YouTube video featuring a former CIA researcher. So talk about intriguing.
It really shows the range of perspectives on this topic, from like hardcore scientific to the really personal.
Exactly. So are we ready to go through all the skepticism, the science, and the stories to see if we can get to the bottom of this? Are psychic powers real?
Yeah, let's dive in.
Okay, great. So one of the articles that you sent is from cafe.com. It describes this experiment, and they call it the weirdest psychology experiment ever. Have you heard of this?
I have, yeah.
Okay, so it involves testing whether people react when someone's staring at them through a video link. And the weird thing about it is that the presence of a believer, someone who believes in psychic phenomena, seemed to be like the key factor in whether those subjects showed a stress response or not. So what do you think about that?
Well, it's interesting because it really kind of challenges, I think, our understanding of how scientific research works, right? Because, if we accept the methodology and it was designed very well, then it leaves us with this, big question, right? Either we have to accept that there's some kind of psychic connection that's real, or we have to, question the standards of evidence that we use in psychological research.
So, one study could overturn decades of research. That's a big deal.
Well, it brings up a huge dilemma, I think, in the study of consciousness, because the act of observing, of believing, maybe that is influencing results, and that comes up a lot with this topic.
Right. Yeah, that definitely sets the stage for this deep dive into some pretty mind-bending territory. And speaking of mind-bending, we can't ignore the CIA's involvement in psychic research, right?
Right.
The Science Focus article that you sent mentions these programs, MKUltra and Stargate. They were exploring the potential of psychic powers, and then, poof, their records were destroyed.
Yeah.
Why all the secrecy? What were they so afraid of us finding out about?
I think it's really fueled conspiracy theories for sure. But even without those documents, we do have some interesting evidence to work with, right? One of your sources is a report by Professor Jessica Utz, and she reviewed decades of government-funded research on this.
Oh, right, the Utz report.
Yeah.
And her conclusions are pretty startling because she basically says that psychic functioning has been well established based on statistical analysis, right?
Yeah, she looked at the statistical significance of the findings from lots of different studies, basically, the likelihood that the results were just due to chance, and in many cases it was incredibly small.
So not just a fluke.
Well, not according to Utz, no. And it's important to note that all this research used really strong methods to rule out any bias and make sure the results were valid, things like blind judging and random target selection.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So what kind of psychic functioning are we even talking about here?
Yeah, so the report uses the term anomalous cognition, which is a broader term, encompasses things like telepathy and clairvoyance and precognition, essentially any kind of perception or knowledge that can't be explained by our normal five senses.
Okay, that clears things up a bit. So you mentioned some pretty intriguing findings from the Utz report. What really stood out to you?
Well, one thing they discovered is that a sender might not always be necessary for anomalous cognition to occur. In other words, you wouldn't need someone consciously trying to, send you a telepathic message for you to receive it.
Hold on. Are you saying our minds are just picking up all these random psychic signals that are just floating around out there?
It's a possibility, yeah.
Yeah.
And another interesting finding is that precognition, the ability to see future events, seemed to work quite well in their experiments, which of course raises all sorts of questions about the nature of time and causality.
That's pretty mind-blowing, and this is all based on solid scientific research, not just anecdotal stories, right?
Exactly, and some of the later research even suggested that psychic functioning might operate similar to our five senses, but instead of detecting physical stimuli, it's like detecting change, maybe even scanning the future for shifts.
So instead of something magical or supernatural, it's just a different way of perceiving and processing information, maybe a sixth sense that we haven't fully tapped into.
That's a really fascinating possibility, and one that was explored by researchers like Russell Targ, whose YouTube talk you included.
Oh, right. Targ was a researcher at SRI, right?
Yes.
And actually worked on some of those CIA-funded studies that we were just talking about. But here's what I find so interesting. He's a physicist, a hardcore laser guy, as he describes himself. Not someone you typically expect to be researching ESP.
Yeah, he's a really unique figure in the field, and he actually had to convince the government of the impossible before he could even start researching psychic phenomena.
Wait, what do you mean?
Well, he had to convince them to fund his laser research first. Basically, he had to prove that he could do the impossible before they would even consider the possibility of ESP.
I guess if anyone can make a case for the unbelievable, it's a laser-wielding physicist. So tell me more about his research. What were some of the highlights of his work with remote viewing?
Oh, there are so many interesting examples, but one that comes to mind is the story of Pat Price, one of Targ's most talented remote viewers.
Oh, yeah. I've heard of him. Didn't he help solve a kidnapping case?
He did. But before we get to that, there's this one experiment that really highlights the potential of remote viewing. Price described a water purification plant in great detail, but when Targ and his team went to the target location, they found a swimming pool.
So, you got it wrong.
Well, not exactly, because they later found out that the site had been a water purification plant like decades earlier, complete with the 2 water tanks that Price described.
Wait, so he was actually seeing into the past?
Yeah, it's possible, and this connects back to what we were saying before, about precognition and the potential for our minds to perceive information outside of our normal understanding of time.
Okay, whoa. Now I'm really curious about this kidnapping case.
So Price was asked by the Berkeley Police Department to help find the car that was used in the Patricia Hearst kidnapping. And not only did he correctly identify the kidnapper from, a mug book, but he described exactly where the car was parked down to the details like the nearby gas storage cylinders and a pedestrian overpass.
Oh.
And they found the car exactly where he said it would be.
Wow, that's incredible. So was Pat Price just super lucky, or was something else going on?
It's a question that comes up a lot in this research, but Price's success wasn't a one-time thing. He consistently produced accurate results, even under controlled conditions.
Okay, so you've got me hooked. Tell me more. What other examples of remote viewing did Targ's research find?
Oh, well, there was one time where Targ himself actually accidentally did remote viewing. He described an airport on an island, and it turned out to be exactly where his colleague was at that time.
No way. Are you serious?
No.
So even the skeptic could become the psychic.
It seems that way, right? And then there's Joe McMoneagle. He was one of the Army officers that Targ trained for the Psychic Army Corps.
Wait, hold on. They had a Psychic Army Corps, like something out of a movie.
Yeah, believe it or not, they did. It ran for 15 years with remote viewers on both coasts. And McMoneagle became one of their star psychics. During his very first remote viewing session, he drew this super accurate picture of a building with stripes in front and a long portion in back. Guess what?
Yeah.
That was the target.
That's pretty cool. So if this research was so successful, why haven't we heard more about it? Why isn't remote viewing a common thing that everyone knows about?
Well, I think part of it is the stigma, right? It's easy to dismiss this kind of research as fringe science, especially when it goes against our conventional understanding of reality.
And there's the whole history of fraud and trickery associated with psychic claims. Marie Jean from one of the articles, she lost thousands of dollars to a psychic scammer.
Yeah, exactly. Cases like that definitely make people wary. But here's the thing. Targ argues that the statistical evidence for remote viewing is just as strong, if not stronger, than the evidence the NIH used to prove that aspirin helps prevent heart attacks.
Wait, are you serious? He's comparing ESP to aspirin.
Yeah, well, he uses this concept of effect size, which is a way to measure, the power of an experiment. And he says the effect sizes in his remote viewing studies were much larger than those in the aspirin studies.
So if we're supposed to trust the science that tells us to take an aspirin, shouldn't we be taking remote viewing seriously too? That's a pretty good argument.
It is, and it makes you wonder why this research isn't more widely accepted.
Yeah, maybe some people were just afraid to believe, right? It's easier to dismiss something as impossible than to really consider the implications if it were actually true.
That's a really good point, yeah. And speaking of implications, there's another story from Targ's research that is really interesting. So he worked with this woman named Hila Hamid, and she was originally brought in as a control subject. They didn't think she had any psychic abilities.
Okay, so what happened? Did she turn out to be, a secret psychic?
Not only a psychic, but she ended up being the most reliable and accurate participant in the program, over a decade. So her first trial with Targ was amazing. She described seeing squares within squares. And guess what? The target was a pedestrian overpass with that exact visual pattern.
Oh, wow. Even the control subject was blowing them away.
I know, right? And then there's this other experiment where they gave Hamid the coordinates for the Berkeley Bevatron, but they gave it to her in binary code just to make sure she wasn't cheating.
That's clever.
Yeah. So how does she do? Well, she described this belly button-shaped energy expander, which is a pretty accurate description of the Bevatron. And her drawing was so detailed that Targ wondered if she was actually seeing the feedback image, the picture they would show her after the session rather than the actual site itself.
Are you saying she might have been seeing her own future?
It's a crazy thought, right? It suggests that maybe time isn't as linear as we think, and maybe our minds can actually access information from different points in time.
It's getting very Back to the Future for me, but it also brings up some really interesting questions about the nature of psychic abilities, right? Like, we've been talking about remote viewing, but, your sources mention all kinds of terms: clairvoyance, clairaudience, telekinesis, mediumship. How do we even make sense of all these different terms?
Well, I think of it as a kind of spectrum of abilities, right? Like some people see them as like totally distinct things, while others see them as different expressions of the same underlying thing, kind of like different facets of a crystal.
Okay, yeah, I like that analogy. So what are like the main differences between these abilities? Like, for instance, what's the difference between clairvoyance and clairaudience?
So clairvoyance is often described as clear seeing. It's about having visions or mental images. And clairaudience is more like clear hearing, like receiving psychic messages in the form of words or sounds.
Okay, so one's visual and the other is auditory.
Exactly. And then there's clairsentience, which is more about like a clear feeling, and it's often associated with empathy, like the ability to sense the emotions of other people.
Oh, interesting. And then, of course, precognition, seeing into the future that we've talked about, and psychometry, which is sensing the history of an object just by touching it. That was always kind of freaked me out.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder if information is actually embedded in objects, or if our minds are somehow tapping into some kind of psychic archive.
Right. Okay, that's a lot to process.
Yeah.
It seems like there's so many ways that our minds could be interacting with the world beyond our five senses.
And it makes you wonder if what we call psychic abilities are really just latent human potentials that we've forgotten how to access.
Right, like a muscle we haven't been using. One of the articles you sent, it mentioned this experiment that wasn't, a government study. It was just this simple experiment about staring at someone through a video link.
Yeah.
But the results were kind of wild.
Oh, you're talking about that one from the cafe.com article? The one they called the weirdest psychology experiment ever?
Yeah, that's the one. It shows how much our beliefs and expectations can really influence the outcome of these experiments.
Exactly. They found that the subject's stress response only went up when the experimenter actually believed in psychic phenomena. It's like the experimenter's belief was somehow affecting the results.
Yeah, that's a little creepy. But it also makes me wonder, if belief is such a big factor, does that mean we can, train ourselves to be psychic? If we believe hard enough, will we suddenly develop superpowers?
Well, it might not be as straightforward as just believing really hard, but the idea that we can cultivate our intuition, that we can enhance these abilities, it's definitely something that comes up a lot in the material you provided.
Right, like that tiny rituals guide that you sent suggested things like meditation and visualization. Mm-hmm. And Targ mentions that Ingo Swann, who's considered one of the pioneers of remote viewing, actually developed a whole training program.
Yeah, and many people believe that anyone can learn to tap into these deeper levels of perception, with practice and the right guidance. It's about quieting the mind, right? Becoming more sensitive to those subtle whispers of intuition.
So maybe it's not about developing superpowers, but it's more about rediscovering a natural human capacity that's kind of been dormant.
I think that's a really beautiful way to put it, yeah.
I've always been fascinated by those stories about people who seem to have that sixth sense, who just know things that they couldn't have possibly learned through normal means.
Yeah, intuition is definitely a powerful force. I mean, we may not understand how it works, but we've all had those gut feelings that turned out to be right.
Yeah, absolutely. But it seems like some people have tapped into something even more profound, like a level of knowing that goes way beyond everyday intuition.
And that brings us back to that big question, right? What is consciousness and what are its limits?
Right. And if consciousness is more than just a product of our physical brains, what other possibilities do that open up? It really feels like we've opened up way more questions than answers. But I'm definitely feeling a lot more open to the possibility that there's more to reality than what we can just see and touch.
Yeah, I think that's a great takeaway. And remember, even if we don't have all the answers right now, just asking these questions can really expand our awareness and our sense of wonder about the world.
Oh, absolutely. And all this talk about psychic abilities has got me thinking about like how they're shown in movies and TV, right? We've all seen those shows and films about psychics, but like how much of that is actually based on reality?
That's a good question. And I think it's important to keep in mind that entertainment, movies and stuff, often they take liberties with real life phenomena. Like psychic abilities in fiction tend to be much more dramatic and kind of over the top, almost like they're superheroes.
Right, like Jean Grey from X-Men, right, with her telekinesis and telepathy, or Eleven from Stranger Things, who can, move things with her mind and even open up portals to other dimensions. It's all very exciting, but probably not very realistic.
Yeah, exactly. Those characters really tap into our fascination with the extraordinary, but they don't necessarily reflect, the subtle and complex nature of real psychic experiences.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of like the difference between, watching a movie about some historical event versus actually reading a detailed account from someone who was actually there.
Yeah.
Like the movie might be entertaining, but that firsthand account is going to give you a much more grounded perspective.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And speaking of grounded perspectives, that Wikipedia article that you sent offers like a more skeptical take on psychic abilities, right? Like it kind of chalks it up to things like trickery, self-delusion, or even just, plain old coincidence.
Yeah, and that's a valid point too, right? We can't just ignore the possibility that some of these phenomena might have, more ordinary, more mundane explanations.
Exactly. Critical thinking is so important. And remember, skepticism doesn't have to mean disbelieving everything, right? It's about approaching claims with a healthy sense of curiosity and questioning.
So how do we find that balance between the scientific evidence and the personal stories, the skeptical points of view, and even the pop culture stuff? It's like trying to solve a puzzle where some of the pieces are missing and some don't even really fit.
Yeah, well, I think the key is to stay open-minded, but also to be, discerning, right? To be willing to consider the possibility that there's more to reality than we currently understand, but also to be aware of the potential for bias or error or even, deception.
Right. It's just like walking that tightrope between belief and skepticism, trying to find that sweet spot where we can, explore the unknown without falling into gullibility or becoming too cynical.
Exactly. And I think one of the most important things we can do is to really pay attention to our own intuition, our own, inner knowing, right? Like maybe what we call, quote unquote, psychic abilities are really just more like heightened forms of intuition that we can all access to some extent.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like those gut feelings you get sometimes that turn out to be right, even if you don't know why you had them.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe by working on our intuition, by paying attention to those subtle hints, those whispers from within, we can start to tap into a much deeper level of knowing, a more connected way of being in the world.
So, okay, let's just say for a minute that we accept that some people can do this. They can tap into this deeper level of knowing. Like, what would that mean for us and for the world around us?
That's a huge question. I think it could completely change the way we think about everything, from how we communicate and how we heal to, how we educate and how we make scientific discoveries.
Yeah. Imagine a world where we could talk to each other telepathically, or diagnose illnesses with our minds, or access information directly from some kind of collective consciousness.
It's mind-blowing, to even think about. And on a more personal level, I think it could really affect our relationships, how we understand ourselves and even our spiritual beliefs.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. If we're not just these isolated beings, but part of something much bigger, like this web of consciousness, that really changes everything. It suggests that we're all, connected and dependent on each other in a way that kind of goes against our individualistic view of the world.
It does. And it also raises the possibility that death might not be the end, right? That maybe it's just a transition to another realm of existence, a realm that, mediums claim to be able to connect with. It's a fascinating thought and often, a comforting one, especially for those who have lost loved ones.
It really is. And this whole deep dive has been quite a journey. We've gone through the skepticism, the science, the stories, and all these incredible possibilities. And hopefully we've left you with a sense of wonder and a desire to learn even more.
Yeah, remember, the journey doesn't end here. never stop questioning, never stop exploring, and never lose that curiosity about the mysteries of the universe.
That's a great way to put it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of psychic abilities. Until next time, keep an open mind and keep looking beyond the known.